Fog sat low over Piney Grove, Arkansas, thick as buttermilk. Delphine Voss walked the fence line before sunup, feed bucket banging against her knee. 47 guinea hens spilled out behind her, screeching, wings clattering like dropped silverware. Her boots sank in the mud. Her breath came in white puffs. The birds scattered into the weeds, heads bobbing, eyes sharp as tacked nails. Delphine didn't slow down. She scattered corn in a wide arc, counting under her breath, checking each bird against a tally in her mind. Her son Huck watched from the porch, arms crossed, not saying a word. The hens moved like a single gray cloud, sweeping through the tall grass along the property line, purple-spotted feathers flashing in the weak light. They didn't cluck. They screamed a sound like a rusted gate hinge over and over. Neighbors 2 farms down could hear it before their coffee finished dripping. Delphine crouched at the tree line, watching the flock disappear into the brush behind the Skiles place, then reappear 20 minutes later, full crops and satisfied. She wrote something in a spiral notebook. She never once looked embarrassed. Folks in Piney Grove had questions. Delphine wasn't answering any of them yet. If you're the kind of person who slows down for a story like this one, go ahead and hit subscribe before we get into it. It helps more than you'd think. And drop a comment telling me what town or state you're watching from tonight. I like knowing how far these stories travel. Izard County sat in the folded hills of the Ozarks, where the roads curved so often that strangers swore they were driving in circles. Piney Grove wasn't even a dot on most maps, just a crossroads store, a Baptist church with a gravel lot, and the old iron truss bridge over Sillamore Creek. Delphine Voss had grown up 3 miles from where she now lived, in a clapboard house her grandfather built with lumber hauled up from the sawmill in Calico Rock. She'd come back to it 2 years ago, divorced, broke, and carrying a boy who just turned 9 and a debt she hadn't chosen. Her husband had left behind an equipment loan, a busted hay baler, and a silence that Huck still flinched at some mornings. Delphine worked the overnight stocking shift at the Harp's grocery in Melbourne, then came home to a farm that hadn't turned a profit since her grandfather's tobacco allotment dried up decades back. She kept a coffee can on the kitchen windowsill where she dropped whatever cash was left over each week. Some weeks nothing went in. Huck used to ask if they were poor. She always told him they were land-rich and cash-poor, which was a kinder way of saying the same thing. Her Aunt Vessie Marsh lived up the ridge and came down most Sundays with a casserole and an opinion. Vessie remembered Delphine's grandfather's farm in its better years, mules in the field, a real dairy operation, hay bales stacked to the rafters. She'd sit at the kitchen table, fork halfway to her mouth, and ask Delphine when she planned on getting real stock. Delphine never answered directly. She'd just refill Vessie's tea and change the subject to Huck's schoolwork. Vessie noticed the notebook Delphine kept by the door, full of numbers and dates, but she never asked what it was tracking. The ridicule came easy in a place where everyone farmed the same 3 things: cattle, hay, and broilers under contract to the poultry co-op in Batesville. Guinea fowl weren't livestock in Izard County. They were a joke, a leftover from grandmothers who kept them for noise and snake scaring, nothing a grown woman raised on purpose in this day and age. Odell Skiles, who ran 200 head of cattle on the land bordering Delphine's, took to calling her place, the asylum, at the feed store, loud enough for her to hear it through the screen door while she counted out change for a bag of scratch grain. County tax notices went out in March, printed on pink paper so nobody could claim they'd missed it. Delphine said what she already knew, 2 years behind, $640 owed, due in full or the parcel went to the courthouse steps auction on the 21st of the month. 21 days. She folded the pink paper into her notebook, next to the tally marks and the numbers nobody understood yet, and went back out to the birds before Huck woke for school. The guineas met her at the gate, screaming their ugly, faithful racket, and for the first time she let herself smile at the sound. What nobody in Piney Grove understood was that Delphine hadn't bought 47 guinea hens on a whim. She'd read every county extension bulletin she could get her hands on about tick-borne illness, Ever since her own mother had spent 8 months bedridden with something the doctors in Batesville couldn't name, until a specialist in Little Rock finally said the words alpha-gal syndrome out loud. Lone Star ticks were thick in these hills, thicker every summer, and Delphine had read that guinea fowl ate them by the hundreds a day, clearing pasture and orchard rows better than any spray a man could afford. She'd bought the Keats baby guineas 2 summers back with money from selling her grandmother's canning jars at a flea market in Mountain View. She raised them in a converted rabbit hutch, moved them to free range once they feathered out, and started walking them, literally walking them like a shepherd, along the tree lines and fence rows of every neighbor who'd let her. Most wouldn't. Odell Skiles ran her off his property twice, hollering that her circus chickens were spooking his cattle. Delphine just moved the flock along the county road easement instead, where the law couldn't touch her. Huck helped some evenings, herding the flock home with a stick and a bucket rattle, though he'd stopped mentioning the birds to his friends at school after somebody's older brother called them the Voss Zoo in front of the whole bus line. He never told his mother that part. He just came home quieter on those days, did his homework at the kitchen table while she recorded tick counts from little glass jars, samples she pulled off drag cloths she dragged through grass before and after the guineas passed through. The number dropped from the 90s down into single digits, week over week, jar after jar. Then the flock started dying, not from ticks, from a stretch of April cold snap that dropped temperatures into the 20s for 4 straight nights, catching the birds out on range before Delphine could get proper shelter built. She lost 9 guineas in a single week, found stiff in the fence corners at dawn, and stood over them in the frost with her bucket still in her hand, saying nothing for a long while. 38 left. The notebook page for that week had no tally marks at all, just a date circled twice, hard enough to tear the paper. Vesey came down that Sunday and found Delphine sitting on the porch steps instead of in the kitchen, casserole going cold in her aunt's hands. "Maybe it's time you let this go," Vesey said, gentle as she could manage. "Get some real cattle. Odell would probably lease you his bull for stud, help you start a herd proper." Delphine didn't answer for a long moment, watching the surviving guineas pick through the yard, wary now sticking closer together than before. "They're doing something, Vesey," she finally said. "I just need 3 more weeks to prove it." Vesey only sighed and left the casserole on the rail. The tax deadline moved closer whether the birds cooperated or not. 15 days left, then 12. Delphine picked up an extra shift at Harp's, came home past midnight, and still walked the fence lines before dawn with what remained of her flock, rebuilding a lean-to shelter out of salvaged tin so she wouldn't lose more to weather. Huck helped her drive nails by flashlight. Neither of them talked about the pink paper folded into the notebook, though both of them knew exactly how many days were left, the way a person knows how many steps are on their own front porch without ever counting. 8 days before the auction, a man named Garrison Teal drove up her gravel drive in a truck with Fulton County, Arkansas plates, and a magnetic sign on the door reading Teal Orchard and Vineyard. He said he'd heard about her from a county extension agent in Batesville, a woman who'd seen Delphine's tick count records at a farm bureau meeting and hadn't been able to stop talking about them. Garrison's peach orchard, 30 miles east, had lost half its harvest crew that season, pickers refusing to work rows crawling with Lone Star ticks after 2 of his workers landed in the hospital. "I don't need to buy your birds outright," Garrison said, standing at the fence while the guineas eyed him with their sharp black stares. "I need to know if what you're doing actually works before I put money behind it." Delphine handed him the notebook without a word, 2 years of drag cloth counts, dates, weather notes, before and after numbers scrawled in pencil. Garrison flipped through it slower than she expected, lips moving as he read. Then he asked if he could bring the flock to his orchard for a week, on trial, before the auction date arrived. Delphine said yes before he finished the sentence. 3 days left. Delphine and Huck loaded the 38 remaining guineas into crates in the truck bed and drove them 30 miles east before sunrise, the birds screaming the whole way like they knew something was riding on the trip. Garrison's foreman, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Ani Ledbetter, met them at the gate looking skeptical, arms crossed the same way Odell Skiles always stood. He walked the rows with Delphine, pointed out where his pickers had been bitten worse the week before, and let the guineas loose without much hope in his face. The flock spread through the peach trees like released water, screaming and pecking. 2 days left. Delphine sat by her phone waiting, while the tax notice sat folded on the kitchen table where Huck could see it too. Neither of them said much that evening. She fed the empty coop out of habit, though every bird she owned was 30 miles away in someone else's orchard, working or not working. She had no way of knowing which. Vesey called to check on her and got only short answers back. The coffee can on the windowsill held $4.12. Delphine went to bed without setting an alarm, since there was no farm chore left to wake up for. On the 6th morning at Teal Orchard, Ani Ledbetter walked the drag cloth through the row nearest the creek, the same row that had sent 2 pickers to the hospital the week before. He knelt in the wet grass and turned the cloth over in the early light, squinting. Then he did it again in the next row and the next. He stood up slowly, took off his cap, and looked out across the orchard at the gray shapes moving between the trees, screaming their ugly racket into the morning air, and said nothing at all for a long moment. By noon, 3 pickers who'd quit 2 weeks earlier had come back to work the rows on their own, word having reached them through their crew leader that something had changed out at Teal's place. They walked the same ground they'd refused before, sleeves rolled up, no fear in their step. Garrison Teal drove the length of the orchard himself that afternoon, stopping every 100 yards to check drag cloths his own foreman had already checked twice. He found what Ani found: almost nothing. He sat in his idling truck for a full minute before picking up his phone and calling the number on Delphine's business card. The call came through on the 5th day, not the 7th, because Garrison hadn't been able to wait. He offered her a standing contract, full care and feeding covered on his land, plus $400 a month to lease the flock through tick season, with an option to buy hatching eggs the following spring. Delphine sat down hard in her kitchen chair, phone pressed to her ear, and asked him twice to repeat the number before she trusted it. Huck stood in the doorway watching his mother's face change, not understanding the words yet, only understanding that whatever they meant, they were good. Word of the contract reached Piney Grove faster than any guinea hen ever screamed. Odell Skiles heard it secondhand at the feed store, from the same clerk who used to laugh along with him, and stood there a long moment without a word to say back. Vesey Marsh heard it from Delphine herself, over the phone, and drove down within the hour with a fresh casserole and an apology she didn't quite know how to phrase, so she just set the dish on the counter and hugged her niece instead. The tax office got their $640 2 days before the courthouse steps auction, paid in full, with $11 left over. By the following spring, 3 other farms in Izard County had guinea flocks of their own, bought as hatching eggs straight from Delphine's incubator, set up in the old rabbit hutch Huck now called the nursery, without a trace of embarrassment. Odell Skiles never apologized outright, being the kind of man who wasn't built for it, but he did ask Delphine one afternoon at the feed store, quiet enough that only she heard it, whether she had any Keats left to sell him. She said she'd put him on the list. The coffee can on the windowsill filled up that year, then filled again. Delphine kept the tally notebook on a shelf by the door, its pages soft and curled from handling, a record of every ugly, screaming bird that had once made her the punchline of Piney Grove. Some evenings she still walked the fence line at dawn, bucket in hand, just to hear that same god-awful racket rolling out over land that was hers to keep. Around Izard County. When somebody's plan looked foolish on the surface, people started saying it might just be wearing feathers nobody had learned to recognize yet.